By the clock on the wall, it says it's time for us to begin. I hate to interrupt Wendell's visiting, but oh, we're in the 7th chapter of First Corinthians. If you want to be turning there, First Corinthians chapter 7. A lot of interesting stuff in this chapter. You'll remember how it began, that he was going to be answering some questions that they had written to him. He's this beginning with this chapter. It's in response to something that they wrote to him specifically about. And this section is going to continue all the way to chapter 11, verse 34. And so within this section, you're going to have him dealing with the issues of marriage that he does in this particular chapter. And, basically saying that whatever state you're in, you need to devote yourself to the Lord. He's going to talk about meats offered to idols, about idolatry itself. There evidently was some question about his apostleship, chapter 9, and the freedom that we have in Christ. What does it mean? And then he's going to deal with the role of women, their position, chapter 11, and the Lord's Supper. And then that chapter ends with verse 34, and it's where he says, and the rest will I set in order when I come. So maybe he didn't address all their questions, or he thinks there might be more questions asked, but he ends this section by saying, I'll take care of it when I come.
Some there when he said the rest I'll care of when I come was dreading that.
They might have been. He kind of asked him, do you want me to come with a rod, or do you want me to come? Your response to what I'm writing is going to determine how I'll be whenever I come. But I thought that was interesting, and I had not thought about that until I was going through this chapter again, and it was pointed out, yeah, this is a section specifically with him responding to questions that they had asked him. We had gotten up to verse 17 in this chapter. If you'll look there, he says, but as God hath distributed to every man, as the Lord hath called everyone, so let him walk, and so ordain I in all the churches. Is any man called being circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Is any called in uncircumcision? Let him not be circumcised. I want to read you that verse from the Amplified New Testament translation. I like the way it kind of takes a look at all the possible meanings here. It says in verse 17, only let each one seek to conduct himself and regulate his affairs so as to lead the life which the Lord hath allotted and imparted to him, and to which God has invited and summoned him. This is my order in all the churches. I think that kind of opens it up, as far as what he's saying. When you become a Christian, is that supposed to affect who you are, where you are, and this sort of thing? No. I mean, it affects you spiritually. Yes, you put to death that old man in sin. There needs to be a change in your life. But as far as the circumstances, it's not going to change your income, is it? Is it going to change what physical family you're a member of? Is it going to change your ethnic background? Is it going to change the country in which you live? No, and that's what he's saying. These are physical situations, and they really are not to be a concern as far as the Christian is concerned. We should be able to be a Christian wherever we are, under whatever circumstances we find ourselves. And what he's saying is, don't let these superficial things become a major thing that you're going to be all worried about and this sort of thing. I've thought about this situation as far as if you're called in circumcision, don't try to be uncircumcised and so on. Why would first of all, what was the circumcision for?
A new covenant.
It was a covenant with Abraham and all of his descendants, and it was basically marking them as his descendants and a Jew later on. Now, as given time and this sort of thing, would there ever be a convenience of not being a Jew?
Well, yeah.
If you're under persecution, you might not want to be identified as a Jew, right? And so I had it crossed my mind, why would that ever even be an issue? But it could be. You know, they were being ostracized economically, they were being persecuted physically, and so on. Wendell?
Over in the Far East, where we're having all this trouble. I can't remember whether I heard it or whether I read it, but one of the soldiers were captured, and they stripped him down, they beat him and everything, and he was circumcised. He wasn't a Jew.
Yeah.
They saw that he was and accused him of it.
Right. Right. Uh, in our country, at least for those of us my age and older, and it may still be, I don't know, but it was pretty much standard practice to circumcise newborn male infants. That has changed somewhat, and parents are able to choose and this sort of thing. So that'd be a little bit harder. But basically, what he's saying, circumcision no longer has anything at all. Do you remember when Jesus uh, was talking to Peter, Matthew 16? He talks about building the church on the confession that Peter had made. And then he goes on to say, whatever you bind on earth is going to be bound, and whatever you loose is going to be. And I had not really thought all that much about the loosing, but what is it? What does the loosing have reference to?
Liberality, and it be too liberal.
The loosing from the old law that was making bonds. And when that loosing took place, those things became a matter of opinion and expediency. Now, he's going to say over in Galatians 5 and verse 6, for in Jesus Christ neither circumcision availeth anything nor uncircumcision, but faith which worketh by love. And so he clearly states circumcision no longer has any religious significance whatsoever. But would it have been a sin for the Jewish parents to continue circumcising their infants? Not at all. Not at all. Nor was it sinful for Gentile Christians to ignore it. No, we don't have to do that. You know, there was a big issue raised over that by the Judaizing teacher, and that was the conclusion in Acts 15. No, Gentiles are not bound by that law. It's been loosed. It no longer is binding. And so that's what he's saying here. But however you become a Christian, that's not to be an issue. You don't worry about that.
And the church there at Corinth, how they were conducting themselves as to who they were, and that's where I
Right.
think I call it liberal. They got liberal.
Do you think that maybe those that were claiming to be followers of Peter might have been those that were wanting to bind circumcision? Could have been, yeah. Uh, we don't know that for a fact, but you know that the Judaizing teachers that came to Antioch were claiming that they came with the authority from the apostles in Jerusalem. They lied. They had not been sent to teach that, but that was what they claimed anyway. And so that may very well have been. He says, let every man, verse 20, abide in the same calling wherein he was called. Now, he's going to go on and he's going to say, and he's going to talk about those that were called being a servant or a slave. He says, care not for it, but if thou mayest be made free, use it rather. And so his statement about every man staying as he is, he's not saying it's illegal for you to change states. It's not illegal for you to get married. It's not illegal for you to be circumcised if that is your preference and that's something you want to do. Uh, you can change your economic, you could change jobs, this sort of thing, but that's not to be a big issue. Uh, Whatever you do, use it for the Lord. And that's what he's saying. If you can be free, if you're a slave and you can become free, then use your freedom, but use it in service to God. He's going to go on and say, for he that is called in the Lord, being a servant, is the Lord's free man. What has he been freed from? How is he free if he's still a slave? He's free from his sin, and he's free to uh, add the fruit of the Spirit. There's no limit in adding the things that we're to do as far as increasing as a Christian. Those things that we can add, our faith, virtue, knowledge, temperance, those that Peter talked about, and then the fruit of the Spirit. There's no law against them. You're free to use those and expand them and increase them. And so, in that sense, you can be a slave, but you're still free as far as the Lord is concerned. You stand before God on the same plane as the person who is your master. He says, all likewise, that is called being free is Christ's servant. If you're a master and you're free and you become a Christian, then you have made yourself a slave to Christ. This you have in Galatians 3, verse 28. Paul said there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there's neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. That's the point that he's making here. That's not to be an issue. He says, you're bought with a price. Be not ye servants of men. We are bound to Christ. We are his. We become his bondservant. He's paid for us in giving his life, shedding his blood, and we are to be his slave and servant, but we are not to make ourselves subject to a human being in that way. We're not to allow anyone else to have that kind of control over us in a spiritual sense. Now, he's not talking about the physical sense. Uh, Usually a slave didn't have any say as to whether he was a slave. A lot of slaves were men who had been captured in war or they had been bought. Maybe they were born into slavery and so on. It was not a matter of choice. Sometimes they had the opportunity, though, to either work off their and get their freedom. They could do that maybe as a soldier. They might be able to do that if somehow they were able to gain enough wealth. Sometimes it was granted by an owner who grew to love that person and wanted them to be free. And so they were to use those opportunities. Yes, sir.
Usually, a lot of times parents would make a deal with a more successful person over there, and they would make a deal with them to have their child or young person. It was that was the bonded
Right.
slaves over there. And normally those were on for a limited period of time. So
Right.
the ones that came over from England and to
Right. There were two kinds of slaves, and even in biblical times, there were two different kinds of slaves. Uh, there was a law as a part of the law of Moses. A Jewish man was not to make a bondservant of a fellow Jew. Now he could have an indentured slave, one that would work for him to pay off a debt. In fact, sometimes people would voluntarily make them a slave to work off a debt that they could not pay for. And the same thing was true in our country's history. There were slaves that came that were abject slaves, bond slaves, had no rights. They were sold and transferred like animals, like cattle. But then there were those who, to buy their passage, would indenture themselves for a given period of time to someone who paid for their passage. It could be 5 years, until they reached 21. It depended on different circumstances, but yeah, there were different kinds of slaves at that time. All right, now we began another section here in verse 25. He says, "Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment of the Lord, yet I give my judgment as one that obtained mercy of the Lord to be faithful." What he's saying here is that the Lord Jesus Christ gave no specific instructions concerning virgins. Now, he did about marriage, Matthew 19, one man for one woman for life. God opposes divorce, but he gave no specific. And so Paul could not reference something that Jesus said while he was on earth. And so now he's speaking, and he's saying he's speaking with the authority of God. He's an inspired apostle. What he's doing is he is fleshing out what Jesus promised his apostles there in John, when he was saying, when I'm gone and the Comforter come, he's going to guide you into all truth. Now, he was going to bring to their remembrance the things that they heard Jesus say, but beyond that, he was going to guide them to give those instructions that Jesus did not give while he was on earth. You think about the letters, the epistles. These are men writing things that Jesus did not say while he was on earth. Church hadn't been established. And so these instructions to Christians had to come by way of the Holy Spirit. And Paul is claiming that right here. He's identifying the fact that he could not go back and reference Jesus said this on a given time, as he was giving instruction. He says, now concerning the virgins, he's going to go on. He says, verse 26, and this is a kind of a qualifier for this entire section. Verse 26 says, I suppose, therefore, that this is good for the present distress. I say that it is good for a man so to be. So he's basically going back to something that he said over at the beginning of the chapter. What did he say? It's good if you don't marry. And we talked about that. Joey, you look like you might be ready to say something. Come on, man.
Go back just a second, if you don't mind.
All right.
Were y'all saying that that's pertaining to servants of men like a worker?
Well, that's what the commentaries say.
Well,
He's saying don't make yourself a slave of someone else in the sense that Christ bought you. Don't give your spiritual self over to someone else.
being free from sin, and I've always looked at that is your friends. Don't be servants of men. Come out of the world. Be that royal priesthood. Be
Right.
peculiar.
Absolutely.
He says, brethren, let every man wherein he is called, therein abide with God.
Right.
We live here, but we're supposed to be different. We let our light shine in a Christian way. And I was thinking, talking about don't be a servant as a worker of men.
Right.
Because he talks about those that are servants and slaves, they can still be Christians in that state of being.
In fact, he's going to give instructions in another book to the slave. You be the best slave that you can be, as though you're serving the Lord. Yeah. That's his instruction.
To get out of sin.
Let me give you an example, Joy, of what I think he's saying. Let's say that you are employed and you know that your employer, to be on his good side, he wants you to go out with him and to participate in some of the activities he's doing.
You just can't do it.
And what he's doing is not something a Christian ought to be doing. Don't allow him to have that kind of control over you. You stand for Christ. Yeah. Hey, we're on the same wavelength, Jimmy.
Sometimes being employed by a person, we'll say, you're his. People don't use the word servant or slave much today, but sometimes you're asked to do things.
Right.
You're expected to do things that's not not on the up and up.
Right.
And that's could get to be a problem.
Oh, it can, and it is a problem in the world in which we live, because people who want to get ahead, their concept is I've got to make more money, I've got to climb the ladder. Uh, Chris has talked about this. Sometimes, if they're going to do it, they're called on to compromise their own standard. Yes, sir, Chris.
You can't serve two masters.
Right.
Serve the one and you.
Right. That's exactly right. Uh, when we're tempted to do that, we probably set the wrong priorities in our life. You reckon? If we're tempted to do that type of thing, then we've set a bad priority. Our priority is not serving God.
If we yield to the temptation,
Right. That's right.
we don't get in trouble.
And I think it's a fact of life. I know certainly in my situation, I've been in situations where the expectation was for me to do something that I could not do. And thank goodness, as far as I can recall, I did not give in. I let it be known that no, I'm not going to do that. But I think that's just a fact of life. And of course, this is a little bit of a different circumstance that he's talking, because we don't. There may be slavery that exists in the world today in parts of our world, but it's not like it was back during this period of time, and even earlier in our own country.
Some of the things you can be asked at this person that's asking ignorance. He don't know, or he don't understand what he's asking you to do. I got into that one time.
That can be, yes, sir.
That was when Fayetteville, North Carolina got blowed away with a hurricane. It blowed in there, and they was needing water. And I was hauling out of Memphis, and they had a load of water for me to deliver to Fayetteville. Well, it was heavy. You only could haul 80,000 pounds. I kept telling them, this ain't going to work. You can't haul that weight, because the scale men, when I drive on them scales, is going to find somebody, and I'm not paying the fine.
Right.
They said it's a government load. It was government water, and they told me that they won't bother you because of that. Was they wrong? He didn't get to the first scale.
Right.
Told me, you turn around, bring that back. They found out they was wrong.
Right.
What they was asking me,
Right.
it listed as stuff like that is
Right.
ignorance, but it makes you lost.
That's true. Any other comments? Don't hesitate. He goes on in verse 27, art thou bound unto a wife? Seek not to be loosed. Art thou loosed from a wife? Seek not a wife. Here again, this is in context of verse 26. And we talked about what that may possibly have been. I'm not for sure that I can specifically, historically say this is definitely it. I do know that this was written somewhere around 50, in the mid 50s AD. I know that Paul was going to lose his life sometime in the late 60s, probably. I know that 70 AD was when Jerusalem was destroyed. But I also know that when Nero was on the throne in the 60s, there was an all out persecution against Christians. He blamed them for the burning of Rome to escape his own guilt. And so he made Christians the ones we're going to go after. It's like Hitler making the Jews those that everybody was going to go after in Germany during the time that he was rising to power. Well, Nero did the same thing with Christians. And so it may very well be that he's talking about this, and through the Holy Spirit, he knows what's coming, and he knows what kind of duress that's going to put people under. And so what he's saying is a recommendation that the Lord has said, okay. He's in no way trying to say that being single is better than being married. He's in no way expressing a negative toward marriage as such. He's not going against what God said at the beginning, that it's not good for man to be alone, that he created Eve as a helper for him, man and woman, for them to live, let's say, to the most fulfilled life as far as humanity is concerned. It's going to be with someone as your helpmate that you go through life with. It's not a sin to remain single. And of course, if you take this and someone remains single so they can fully devote themselves to the Lord, that can be good. You know, this is this is where the monastic movement got started, people, was what he was saying concerning remaining single. We've seen what that movement has led to in that religion, haven't we? Because those who were claiming to remain celibate did not always remain celibate. In fact, many of them did not, and they became involved with homosexuality. They also abused women as well, some of the nuns. And so he knew what he was talking about, and he's not establishing a monastic movement. In fact, if you go to Colossians, the second chapter, he talks about will worship and those things that give an appearance of right. And he mentions specifically abusing your body, beating your body, uh, not giving it what it needs, sleeping on a stone ledge instead of in a bed, comfortable bed. Depriving yourself of those things that typically a person needs as far as their physical body is concerned. He says these things have a show of wisdom, forced humility, but they have nothing to do with you being a better spiritual person. He says don't taste it, don't touch it, don't have anything to do with it. That would be his words concerning the monastic movement as a whole. He's not endorsing that, nor is he establishing that here in this. He's speaking concerning a specific situation that he was aware that was coming, and he was trying to spare them. And he's going to go on and he's going to explain further what he's talking about here. He says, and if thou marry, thou hast not sinned. And if a virgin marry, she has not sinned. Nevertheless, such shall have trouble in the flesh, but I spare you. In other words, I want to spare you. And he's going to go ahead and he's going to flesh that idea out. He says, but this I say, brethren, the time is short, it remaineth that both they that have wives be as though they have none, and they that weep as though they weep not, they that rejoice as though they rejoice not, and they that buy as though they possess not, and they that use the world as not abusing it, for the fashion of this world passeth away. So he's talking about several things here, not just marriage, but he's just talking about uh, the human experience of the things that are part of this life. There's rejoicing, there's weeping, there's marrying and giving in marriage and so on. There's possessing, there's selling and buying and this sort of thing. And he says the time's coming when that's not going to matter. He's saying all this is going to be destroyed. And so our focus doesn't need to be on the physical and what's taking place. Our focus needs to be on that which is eternal and a relationship with God. That's what he's trying to get them to see. And basically that's what we pull from this. And then he goes on in verse 23. He says, "But he that is married careth for the things that are of the world, how he may please his wife." And so, as I said, he's going to flesh out this situation of saying it's better if you're not married. And so this is what he's trying to say. The person who is married has a host of responsibilities, doesn't he? If we take the male role in the marriage, he becomes responsible for his wife, for the children, for the household, and so on. He has a leadership responsibility. He has a responsibility to care for them, protect them, and so on. And it's not wrong. Those are God-given responsibilities. In fact, Paul's going to say in another place, if a man doesn't take care of his own, he's worse than an infidel. He's worse than the person who claims to not even believe in Christ. And so he is in no way taking away from those responsibilities. He's just recognizing the fact that this man has responsibility that will affect, to some extent, what he can do for the Lord. Doesn't have to affect how devoted he is, or how much he loves the Lord, or how much he wants to obey the Lord. But reality says he can't always just devote all of his time to the Lord, because he has other responsibilities. And he's going to say the same thing about the wife. And so that's the whole crux of the situation as far as what he's saying here.
You know, that instance it's bad that people, men, live a life not facing up to the responsibilities that God intended for them to, till it's too late in life to turn it around.
Yeah. Right.
They miss a lot being that way.
You know, I don't know where the misconcept. I know that some people have gone to the Old Testament and the cultural norm that was for husbands and wife there, and in some way they came away thinking that the men were to treat their wives as property. They were less than on a level with man. Somehow she was subservient, and this sort of thing. They'll go to the verse that is commending Sarah for calling Abraham Lord. Uh, she was doing nothing than other what Paul was saying in Ephesians, the 5th chapter, that a wife needed to respect her husband, to submit to her husband. That's all he was saying. But there there's been a warped view, and it's carried over into our culture as well. And you're right, Jimmy. A lot of times men did not treat their wives like Paul instructed them to do, to love her as he loved himself.
And I think that was worse in men's life that didn't never live a Christian life.
Well, when a man does that, he makes it very difficult for the wife to respect him like she should. And so it certainly has ramifications to that relationship. And you think of the example that it sets as far as the children are concerned, too. You know, parents serve as role models for their children. And they grow up thinking this is the way I'm supposed to act as a husband, as a father, and so on. And so we need to be very, very concerned about that. We really do. And like you say, Jimmy, sometimes we don't realize until it's too late, because our children are grown and gone, and they've established their personalities and their own families and so on.
See that parents that was of that nature, as their children grew up and become mature, they lost their, they didn't have respect for their parents that
Right.
they should have, and they were the cause of it.
Right. That's true. That can happen. All right. He goes on here. He says there's a difference also between a wife and a virgin. The unmarried woman careth for the things of the Lord, that she may be holy, both in body and in spirit. But she that is married careth for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. So again, he's just talking about the reality here of the married life. He talked about the male first, his responsibility, and then he's taking a look at the female in this situation. And he's giving some general statements. Uh, we we live in a world in which single young men and women don't devote themselves to the Lord, do they? Not typically. And we're finding even those that grow up in a Christian home aren't always devoted to the Lord. And so he's making these statements, and Culturally, that was probably more true here than it is today. But he's talking about at least the possibilities uh, that if that single person is devoted to the Lord without having these physical entanglements that come with marriage, they can devote themselves more fully to the Lord. He says, and I speak this for your own profit, not that I may cast a snare upon you, but for that which is comely, and that ye may attend upon the Lord without distraction. Uh, in this translation, that verse says, now I say this for your own welfare and profit, not to put a halter of restraint upon you, but to promote what is seemly and is in good order, and to secure your undistracted and undivided devotion to the Lord. Which again, that just kind of opens up what the King James language is saying here. He says, but if a man think that he behave himself uncomely toward his virgin, if she passes the flower of her age and need to so require, let him do what he will, he sinneth not, let them marry. He's going to talk about two instances of virgins here. This is the case of a man who is betrothed. He's a virgin, she's a virgin. And so he's saying, if you determine that you can maintain self control and she's going to maintain self control, then it's not sinful for you not to marry. Now, if he's betrothed, there actually has been an agreement. In fact, the betrothal was a contract that was as solid as marriage itself. And so the Lord is saying, if you want to remain a virgin and single and not consummate the marriage, then that's okay. He says, nevertheless, he that standeth steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but hath power over his own will, and hath so decreed in his heart that he will keep his virgin, doeth well. So it's almost like they're going to maintain this relationship, but they're just never going to consummate. And that may very well be. Uh, the International English translation of the Bible basically has this entire section talking about a man and his the one he's engaged to, not a father and his virgin. Now I think there's a change in reference, and he's going to talk about the father who has a virgin daughter, and we'll see that in just a little bit. He says, so he that giveth her in marriage doeth well, but he that giveth her not in marriage doeth well as well. Now he changes from the husband to the father. This is a culture where all marriages were established by parents, and they had to agree to the marriage. It wasn't a matter where some girl met a man, she became interested and they decided they were going to marry. That was not done culturally. Good example of this goes back to Abraham when he got a wife for Isaac. You remember? He told his slave to go back to the area that they came from, to their relatives, and to take a woman from their family to be their son's wife. And of course, he was fortunate. The servant went and he prayed to God that he would give him a sign. And he established the sign that was going to be made. It was going to be the maid that when he asked for a drink, she would offer him a drink. And then she would offer to draw water for his camels as well. And of course, Rebecca comes out. Rebecca is Laban's daughter. Laban is Rebecca's, I said Rebecca came out. Laban is Sarah's brother. And so when Rebecca comes out, she does exactly what the servant said, and he knows that the Lord has answered his prayer. And she agrees to go back with him. And you'll remember that she had never seen Isaac. And they see him in the field, and She asks the servant who it is. He tells her that it's his master's son. That's to be her husband. She puts the veil on back on herself. She's been riding without the veil, but culturally, she's meeting a man she doesn't know, so she covers her face again. And it says he took her as his wife, took her to Sarah's tent, and he loved her. You think they just automatically looked at each other and said, "I'm in love with you"? The love he had for her was agape love. She's his wife. There is a consummation that was established by parents there. And so their love was one that was the agape love. And I'm sure it developed into the romantic love. I don't have any question about that. But that's an example of what was done in that particular culture, Wendell. You're right. Later on, that becomes something that they're not to do. Uh,
You can marry a second and own that.
call them kissing cousins when they're far enough away that you can marry them. And even in our country's history, there were a lot of marriages that were established that were between kissing cousins because they wanted it to stay in the family. But talking about marriage and relatives, it's evident that Cain married either a sister or a niece. That's the only place he could have gotten a bride. Now, how many generations down? I don't know. I don't know what age he married. Uh, I do know that they didn't marry in their teens to begin with. Isaac was 30 years old when he married.
Situation.
It is, but as our humanity was getting established, things had to be a little bit different. And of course, as it progressed, new laws were established. The law of Moses, of course, prevented uh, marriage between close relatives. And we know that that's not the best. When people violate that law, it has been shown historically, especially in the uh, royal families of England and other countries where close relatives married, that it brings about deformity, sometimes mental deformity, and so on. And so, anytime we violate God's law, we're headed for trouble. Uh, the going on here, he says, the wife is bound by the law as long as her husband liveth, but if her husband be dead, she is at liberty to be married to whom she will, only in the Lord. There has been a host of varying opinions as far as what he's saying here, as far as the Christian widow. And I'm thankful that Chris supplied me with several different commentaries. And I have been looking and looking and reading this and finding out basically what is being said here. There is a book that is a group of sermons. It was edited by Dub McLeish. Some of you may have heard him or know of him. He's a faithful minister of the gospel. He edited this book, and it contains basically a series of lessons that were developed and preached by various members of the Lord's church. This particular chapter on chapter 7 was written by James Meadows, and he deals with this particular issue. The question comes up as to the phrase only in the Lord. Is it an adjective phrase modifying the person that she's to marry, or is it an adverbial phrase talking about the marrying process? Um, and I found it interesting. James goes into a study here. He says to apply the phrase only in the Lord to the man she is marrying is to make it the phrase adjective or an adjective phrase modifying the force of that. And he says this is a prepositional adverbial phrase. It's not an adjective phrase, and that is evident from the language. The Greek language was very clear as far as the force of what it was saying, as to whether it was an adjective phrase or an adverbial phrase. And so he's saying this is an adverbial phrase. It cannot modify the man. The kids are coming in. We're going to stop here, but y'all do your study, your homework, and see what you come up with. Now, the Gospel Advocate commentary, which most of you may have, is going to say it means only in the Lord, that it modifies the man, not the other. But David Lipscomb could be wrong too.